Hey, Pam, do you know the factors that can make ordinary conflict and misunderstandings get worse and damage relationships between family, friends, coworkers, and neighbors?
I do, Renee, and that's why we're welcoming everyone to this courageous conversation. We're gathered here because we want to stop the hate that leads to violence. By reducing fear, depolarizing our communities, and enhancing civic participation, we can prevent extremism and targeted violence.
Today, our topic is high conflict, and we're connecting the dots between the personal and the political. Now, this is a sensitive and important topic, and it can make people uncomfortable. So we need to be courageous in both our sharing and our listening. We'll start by defining the difference between good conflict and high conflict. And then we'll work in small groups to practice looping for understanding, a listening technique that helps reduce conflict. Then you'll get a chance to practice and apply these skills in a small group conversation for yourselves. Hey, Pam, do you remember how totally jazzed we were when we first read High Conflict by Amanda Ripley?
I sure do. I remember how the book inspired us to write the grant for this project.
Yeah.
Amanda Ripley is a journalist who hated how she got stuck in the noise and chaos of conflict over and over again. In her book, she tells stories about people who discovered how to transform harmful conflict into productive dialogue and discussion. She now offers training programs to journalists and others who want to understand conflicts in our society, not just argue about them. I've done a lot of conflict resolution training, but Amanda's approach helps us better understand ourselves and one another in our complex world. We were honored, weren't we, when she agreed to come into our Courageous Rhode Island podcast?
Oh, it was great. Let's take a look at that now, shall we? And see what that piece is all about. We are going to play a little excerpt from that podcast interview now. Who are new to this work, could you help them understand the difference between productive conflict and harmful conflict? Why is this distinction so important today?
Yeah, so it turns out that, the headline is conflict is not the problem, right? I mean, conflict is something we need as humans, as communities to get better, to be pushed, to push each other. So that's all good. The problem is when it tips into something that the researchers call intractable conflict or malignant conflict or high conflict. I like high conflict because it sounds like 10% less terrifying than those other options. And so high conflict operates really differently than what I like to call good conflict or healthy conflict. And there are lots of differences, but some bright lines that have helped me to recognize the difference really quickly include, in high conflict, you often see hatred or contempt. In good conflict, you see anger, right? So in all the research on emotion and conflict, anger is okay. Anger is initiatory, right? So contempt is much harder to deal with because contempt suggests that there is no hope, that the other side or the other person will never change. And the same with disgust. Disgust is very hard to deal with in the research. Not impossible, but much harder. And then in the research that was done at the Difficult Conversations Lab, which is a really interesting place at Columbia University, led by Peter Coleman, they found that good conflict conversations, even over really difficult, loaded, controversial subjects, good conflict conversations tend to have more questions that get asked and a more movement. So you might have anger and frustration, and then you have flickers of curiosity or understanding or even humor, God forbid, and then back to anger and frustration. So there's this sense of like a galaxy of emotions as opposed to just being stuck in the same one or two hostile emotions over and over. So those are some of the differences.
When we're feeling strong feelings, we generally don't take the time to name them. But take a look at this slide. We see a lot of different emotion words, and we can see here some of the traps of high conflict. For example, in high conflict, we might feel contempt for others when their ideas are repugnant to us. But an alternative to contempt is anger. In high conflict, we can become closed to ideas, whereas in good conflict, we stay open to them. In high conflict, we may simplify ideas, whereas in good conflict, we embrace complexity. We can shift from the feelings of predictability to the possibility of surprise. Simply put, high conflict can lead to violence, and good conflict can lead to learning. Now, these ideas are both personal and political. The framers of the Constitution knew all about the power of good conflict to help people make better decisions. It's an essential part of the process of democratic self-governance.
Yeah. And to recognize high conflict, we need to pay attention to fire starters, 4 accelerants that make conflict truly dangerous. Humiliation is a big one. Everyone has experienced it at one time or the other. It happens when someone says or does something to lower your status in ways that are public and painful. Politicians and scholars have discovered that the experience of humiliation is a powerful pain point. Nelson Mandela once said, "There is no one more dangerous than one who has been humiliated." Such experiences are awful and unforgettable. They can shape people's behavior for a lifetime. Humiliation can intensify the desire for revenge. In my work as a prevention educator, I have always said, hurt people hurt people. Humiliation is a fire starter. It intensifies conflict. Corruption is another one. We count on our leaders to be fair. When people feel their leaders cannot be trusted, it activates conflict. When leaders exploit their power for personal gain, we may feel a deep need to share our grievance with others. Aristotle explained that anger over corruption can be a driving force that pushes people to take action. Corruption is a fire starter. It intensifies conflict.
Yeah. Another fire starter is binary group identities. It's a fire starter we're going to talk about a lot in the Courageous Conversations series because people like the feeling of being a member of an in-group, and it creates a positive sense of belonging. And this positive feeling can be harnessed to hate. When people who are not within the in-group become targets of stereotyping and often quite overt discrimination. For example, you're likely to have inaccurate stereotypes of people in your outgroup, whether those people are new immigrants, Republicans, Democrats, or even people who don't live in your state or your country. Binary group identities, us versus them, ways of thinking about people, that's a fire starter, and it intensifies conflict. Now, conflict entrepreneurs are the last fire starter on the list. We found this concept so important that we devoted an entire Courageous Conversation session to it. And we encourage you to check that one out and participate in one of those. Conflict entrepreneurs are the people or institutions who exploit conflict for power, pleasure, or profit. You can immediately recognize how people in media and politics do this, of course, because likes and shares are part of the attention economy. In fact, conflict entrepreneurs are everywhere. We all know someone who finds ways to get in between people who are in conflict and make the problem worse. Conflict entrepreneurs are fire starters. They intensify conflict.
Yeah, one last thing, Renee. In your podcast interview with Amanda Ripley, you acknowledged that conflict can be fun and that fire starters can become addictive, which also fits with my understanding of the adrenaline addiction that can accompany high-intensity media experiences like some video games.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Pam. I will admit that fires can be fun to watch and conflict can be entertaining. And I personally have also used conflict to my advantage. So I have to kind of admit that. That's partly why it's hard to detach from a culture of conflict. Think of what happens when a fight breaks out on the school playground, right? Everybody gathers around to watch. Conflict is baked into so many aspects of our society that these fire starters can come to seem normal. But that's what makes them truly dangerous. Once you've been really harmed by high conflict, that opens up your mind to the possibility of change. In our discussions about preventing violent extremism, remember, we found that extremists seek radical change in society stemming from their religious, social, or political belief systems, and the belief that their success or survival can only be accomplished through hostile action or violence. When people use conspiracy theories and propaganda and disinformation against members of an outgroup, it can inspire violence. And this is why we have to work every day to detach from the addictive qualities of high conflict. And we have to look and help to create good, generative conflict that leads to learning.
I agree wholeheartedly. And for some time now, many schools have been teaching kids to be upstanders instead of bystanders to bullying and fights at school. And we adults can learn prevention and ally skills too. One of the best ways to detach from the allure of conflict is to practice active listening that transforms conflict into an opportunity for learning. Amanda Ripley talks about one listening technique she calls looping for understanding. Looping is a communication technique that transforms how we listen and connect with the others. This technique is used by conflict mediators and psychologists, and it enables us to prove that we are trying to really understand one another. Looping builds trust. Step 1 is to listen. Tell me more. Listen for what seems most important to the other person. Step 2 is paraphrase. Articulate not exactly, but the essence of what you understood and heard. Step 3 is to check in. Ask with curiosity if you got it right. If you sense any hesitation from the other person, go back to step 1 until you get it right. And step 4 is tell me more again. Dig deeper. Invite the person to investigate underneath their usual talking points. Remember to ask about red flag words. They may hint at important values, beliefs, and emotions. Now let's listen to another part of the podcast you had with Amanda Ripley, where Amanda describes looping for understanding as a kind of deep listening.
Now, in your book, you offer some really strong insight from your study of the very careful way that listening and good listening skills can be part of the solution. And you use a term that called looping for understanding. And it's a strategy that people can use to listen better. Can you describe the key elements of this strategy and how people can begin to incorporate this into their daily life?
Absolutely. Yeah. This has been the thing that has most transformed my own behavior personally and professionally. So I can't overstate how helpful it has been. There's different forms of deep listening or tactical listening, it's sometimes called. This one we learned from Gary Friedman, who's a conflict mediator, who's in the book. But it basically is a way to listen deeply to what the other person's saying. Listen for what's most important to them, right? Not to you, which is hard because I now train journalists on this and we find that's a hard one for them to get used to. But you can, after like practicing for 10 minutes, you can start listening to what's most important to them. Then once your brain is sort of full, so to speak, you can interrupt them politely and you check to see if you're getting that, right? So you distill what you've heard into the most elegant language you can come up with, right? Not robotically repeating back what they say, because that can be kind of condescending, right? Even if you don't mean it that way, but distilling it into your own language and checking if that's right. So this is another thing that's easy to forget, but actually saying, it sounds like you're saying you felt utterly ignored by the way that I treated you at Thanksgiving. And it was hurtful. Is that right? So checking, is that right? With genuine curiosity, right? Which is hard to do. But if you practice it enough, it gets easier and easier. And then they'll tell you, well, it's actually, I didn't feel ignored. I felt disrespected. So they add to it. And then you loop it again, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So you felt, belittled and disrespected and like you didn't count. Is that right? You just keep going around this loop until you get until they say exactly or something like that. And then this amazing thing happens where, first of all, you've now understood them a little better, hopefully. And secondly, they feel understood. So now they can listen. But conflict is really like a game of chicken. Like we will not listen until we feel heard. So who's going to listen first? That's the question.
What do you love about what Amanda just said, Pam?
I just love that last thing that Amanda said. The conflict is like a game of chicken. We will not listen until we feel heard. That's why practicing listening skills is such an important ingredient in the courageous journey.
Yeah. So now it's your turn. We're going to try to apply these ideas in a small group discussion. Here are the question prompts. They invite you to tell a short story from your own life. Here's the 2 questions you can choose from. Can you think of a time in your life when conflict was actually useful? When you learned something you didn't know about yourself, the problem, or the other person? What happened? Or question 2, think about a conflict you've experienced that was more harmful than helpful. It can be political or personal, big or small. What happened? In your group, you'll tell a story and your group members will practice looping for understanding. Awesome. All right. So now it's your turn, right?
Yeah, it's a turn for everyone else to have a conversation and practice looping for understanding. You can use and apply what you've just learned about high conflict and deep listening to your own life.
Have a courageous conversation. Thanks for being part of it. Bye now.
Have fun.